It appears that we are live. Well, thank you all very much for joining us today. We are absolutely delighted that we have such a large number of people from many different countries following this event, particularly as it is what I would have imagined anyway was a very technical subject. If all of those that have registered turn up, we will be something like close to 200 people here today. So I'm very happy with that. It's probably a bit more than we normally have. My name is Simon Osborne. I am the CEO of IFI Global, which is a research and media house based in the City of London. And we focus on the alternative side of the fund business and increasingly also ESG as well. With me on the panel, we have, it takes a second for this thing to kick into action, but it does always do it. Let's give it a go. So hopefully it will do it now. I'll carry on talking whilst it kicks into action. Why isn't it not kicking into action? Okay. So I will carry on and hopefully this thing will finally kick into action. We have Conrad Axelrod, who is a partner at King and Spalding, which is a law firm in New York. We have Emily Haithwaite, who's group partner at Ogier. We have Simon Firth, a partner at Arnold & Porter in London. And we have Philip Bricky, who's head of business development in the US with Jersey Finance. Before going into the panel, I'm going to give this one more go. Why are we having a particular problem in the connection here? Ah, finally, it's kicked in. So there you are. Proof of what I've just said is true. Here are the panel on the screen. Before, as I was just saying, before getting into the panel discussion, I thought what I would do today is just give you a few scene setting slides to prep the discussion. And then, as I say, we will get into the panel. And before doing that, I wanted to thank Jersey Finance very much indeed for sponsoring this event today. By the way, we will try and take the odd questions as we go along. We do encourage questions, and we might try and take one as we go, or a few, or more than one as we go along. But we will also reserve hopefully about 10 minutes at the end for questions as well. So the scene setting slide, I think these three things are particularly critical to where we are today. The first one is in January last year, ESMA sent out this reminder on the rules of reverse solicitation in light of what it called some questionable practices. ESMA wanted to point out that it knew that these questionable practices, as it called them, were taking place, and it added that these questionable practices were appearing more frequently since Brexit, and they were going to be monitoring that, and they were concerned about that. So that was in January of last year, and then in August last year, we had the EU's cross-border distribution directive, which includes in it, and this hasn't, in my view, been talked about nearly enough, by the way, includes in it a stipulation that regulated AIFs in the EU can no longer pre-market their funds without notification to national regulators. And this includes even managers with long-standing relationships with an investor just discussing investment ideas, chewing the cud in the normal way that one does. Whilst that only applies officially to regulated EU AIFs, some member states then said that the rule should also apply, and this is the important point for reverse solicitation, that rule should also apply to non-EU AIFs as well as the ones in the EU in order to create a level playing field. I'll come back to that in a second. And then just in January this year, just last month, ESMA's executive director, Verena Ross, in a letter to John Berrigan at the European Commission, said, and that letter, by the way, is up, or it was a few days ago anyway, on ESMA's website, And she said that reverse solicitation is being used to circumvent the rules on third country passport regimes, and therefore there is an unlevel playing field. And there was quite strong language, and anyone's interested in that, I do suggest you go to the ESMA website and have a look at that. So what appears to be happening, and we're going to be discussing this in a minute, is that the changes coming in to European distribution for alternative managers, whether they be in the EU and particularly outside the EU, is that any, and this is particularly for third country managers, any new subscription coming into a third country manager's fund under reverse solicitation, the manager may well have to wait up to 18 months before taking that investment for the notification reasons that I just gave you. And there are administrative and even criminal penalties for not doing that. So it's not that the European Union, the national regulators, or ESMA is actually going to, quote unquote, bring reverse solicitation to an end. It's just that with this 18-month delay, that it could be problematic to use in future. So what we're going to talk about today is, in light of recent regulatory developments such as those I've just touched upon, what are the risks of relying upon reverse solicitation? If the bull market is over, are the risks of reverse solicitation further increased? What is the role of distribution intermediaries? That's a term I've just come up with in the last few days in preparation for this event. But what are the role of distribution intermediaries like placement agents and mancos in reverse solicitation? And what are the other distribution options open to managers other than for third country managers, other than using reverse solicitation? And will managers keep using reverse solicitation until someone is fined? So these are the kind of topics we're about to get into. Just before doing that, I should mention that we launched a publication last autumn called FSI, primarily for US managers and their advisors when they're going overseas, i.e. coming to Europe or going offshore. And in conjunction with that, we've launched something called Selection Intelligence Service to help not just US managers, but particularly US managers on the selection of independent directors, third-party domiciles, third-party mancos selection, and service providers. And we decided to add to that, we're going to do something on distribution. This is clearly a subject that is of interest to everyone. So if you are a subscriber to any of our publications, whether we now have 4, if you are a subscriber, you are able to access our Selection Intelligence Service, and we will give you advice as best we can on distribution, as well as those other things that are on the screen. And just remember, all of you out there, and I know there's quite a lot of managers joining us today, including in the US, once you've made your distribution choice, selected your domicile, your service providers, your fund directors, etc., it is difficult to go back. So my strong advice is to consult very widely or repent at levers. So I'm going to stop sharing screen and bring the panel in. Thank goodness I managed to click on the right button. And I'm going to ask a broad question to start with, and then we're going to go through a series of questions after that. As I say, do please join in and ask a question should you wish to do so. So Simon, can I come to you first and ask you whether you think it's going to be viable for third country managers to continue reviews using reverse solicitation, given the issues I've just touched upon, and perhaps others as well?
Yeah, sure. And good evening, or yes, good afternoon, good evening to everybody. This reminds me when I was in a hotel in Boston where there was a sign on the wall outside the front entrance saying no solicitors. So I thought I'd better get out of the way quite quickly. And there's another sign saying don't reverse. So the question is, can you be a solicitor and reverse? I don't think reverse solicitation in itself has changed. I think what's changing is the world around us and the increasing regulations. So the AIFMD doesn't actually define reverse solicitation, but it says the directive does not affect the current situation where a professional investor established in the EU may invest in AIFs on its own initiative, irrespective of where the AIF and or the AIFM is established. So that really sets the scene. And the regulations, though, since then, even since that came in 8 years ago, have changed quite considerably. And so clearly the more regulations there are that affect you if you're marketing in the European Union or the UK, which is still largely based on that law, the more the burden of regulation. And so in effect, the more the benefit of being able to avoid it through reverse solicitation. So Simon mentioned the cross-border distribution directive, the AIFMD is under review, that might get tightened. In the last couple of years, we've had SFDR disclosures that are required if you're marketing in Europe. So, you know, the ability to use reverse solicitation does have some benefits. So Simon referred to the letter from ESMA, who was saying that consideration should be given to the introduction of new reporting requirements, allowing them to collect information on reverse solicitation. So what might that reveal? If they're actually able to gather that information, they may have some quite surprising results. They may find managers with a number of reversedly solicited investors, which, if there's a high number, may imply that that in some way was engineered. And also, you know, it only takes one disgruntled investor to come back and say, actually, you shouldn't have sold that to me, put me right on it. Interestingly, ESMA did have a comment on this last year when they were talking about MiFID reverse solicitation in the context of Brexit. And they said that where an EU client is provided with investment services by a non-EU firm, that should not be deemed a service provided at the own exclusive initiative of the client, regardless of contractual clauses or disclaimers purporting to state the third country firm will be deemed to have responded to the exclusive initiative of the client. So I think you could apply that by analogy to the AIFMD once they start to focus more heavily on this, which we expect the Commission to be doing later on. So, you know, I think the possibilities of reverse solicitation are, or the risks of reverse solicitation are increasing. And then we need to weigh up whether is it really such a bad thing to register under national private placement rules. And I'm sure we'll discuss that as we go along.
Thank you very much, Simon. Can I come to you, Emily? Ask you for your general sort of overall thoughts on where we are.
Indeed, yes. Hello, everybody. So clearly there is a concern that managers have been relying on reverse solicitation to a greater extent than that which was anticipated under the AIFMD when it came into force in 2013. And in many ways, it's peculiar that this is only just becoming an issue now that's being discussed at EU level, because it appears that there's actually been no mechanism at EU level, or indeed at most member state national levels, to collate any tangible data relating to reverse solicitation. And in fact, in the letter you mentioned, Simon, those very few member states which do seem to collect the data, it appears that reverse solicitation was the norm rather than the exception. So I'm not sure what we take from that. So clearly this is now fueling the sense that the marketing regime under the AIFMD, which was meant to harmonise practices across the EU and create a level playing field, is actually being undermined. It seems to me this is going to give rise to additional new reporting requirements to enable information on reverse solicitation to be collected, in addition to those constraints that are going to be placed on managers under new cross-border distribution rules. I mean, my view is that these things don't tend to go away. The Pandora's box has been opened, so to speak, and in fact, they build momentum. So I think it should lead to some more thoughtful consideration being given to alternative routes for fund distribution, and I think we'll try and explore some of these in the next hour or so.
Thank you very much. And likewise, Conrad, can I come to you for your observations from New York on where you see this going?
Absolutely. And good afternoon, everyone. And thank you for joining us. A little known secret is that I actually started my career at a financial regulator. And so I have a little bit of firsthand experience with exploring policy changes and implementing new regimes. The upshot, as I see it sitting here in New York, is that the remnant of reverse solicitation, as it was originally conceived, perhaps 10 years ago in the rollout, was that this was something that would be relied on initially for a few years and would naturally diminish over time as the level playing field took hold, and in particular, third country passporting was made available. That to us is a promise that hasn't necessarily been fulfilled. And as a result, there is a regulatory arbitrage, which creates an ongoing reliance on reverse solicitation. My concern here is that in promulgating new rules, as Emily says, we've kind of skipped the information gathering stage. And I think that would be a very helpful starting point here. And we've seen steps towards that in the US as well.
That's a good point, which I hadn't really thought about. And I think is the blind leading the blind at the moment to a certain extent. So, and Philip, lastly, can I come to you on your general observations, overall observations before we get into the nitty gritty?
Certainly. Thank you, Simon, and good afternoon, everyone. Well, managers have sought to really bypass the full scope of AIFMD and by not marketing directly to EU investors. And to Emily's point, it was supposed to be the exception. In fact, it turned out to be perhaps the norm. But clearly, the EU has placed reverse solicitation in its crosshairs, and the sort of increased gymnastics that one has to go through in order to make it work are becoming increasingly tenuous. Now, I think there are readily available alternatives that keep the managers outside of the full scope of AIFMD, but still offer the sort of predictability and the certainty that they can rely on. I know we're going to get into this discussion, but we'll, I think, get into a little bit more detail on the national private placement regimes and how that can be used to access the market.
Okay, thanks. Okay, and let's get into the specific questions then. And the first one I'm going to address at you, Simon. What do you think, because you touched upon a bit of this in your opening statement, I appreciate, but nonetheless, what are the risks? Just if you could focus upon the risks, what are the risks in light of, as Philip, I think, put it very well, the fact that ESMA and the Commission have got reverse solicitation in their crosshairs, and we don't know what's going to come out necessarily, particularly but something, and there is going to be, there are going to be things that aren't going to be necessarily particularly friendly to reverse solicitation. So what are the risks for managers relying upon a reverse solicitation going forward?
Yeah, so the mantra here is really, you can't have a marketing or a distribution strategy that is called or labeled or relies on reverse solicitation. Whereas in fact, we know that there are methods and systems available to people to effectively engineer reverse solicitation. Some of them are quite elaborate. They do involve some of the things we've discussed about heavy representations and warranties on the side of the subscriber to say that everything is done at their own initiative. So I think it only takes one fund manager to fall here and have the spotlight put on them for a lot of things to be looked at under the bonnet by the regulators, and them to start to focus on this. I mean, I may be wrong here, but I suspect they haven't had this as a priority. But people have been talking about potential enforcement here for a long time, and it's never really happened. So that's, there's the enforcement side if something does turn out to have been engineered or not a genuine reverse solicitation, and that can involve criminal sanctions as well. And then there's clearly the investors. So if the investor says, hang on, you shouldn't have done this, and that, these are the actual facts, there was no reverse solicitation, then you've got the classic put option in the hands of the investor to be put right, particularly if the markets fall and he loses cash. So, those risks have always been there, but I think they're greater now given the higher cost and the unlevel playing field against, let's say, EU players with the level of regulation that is now coming in.
Thank you. We're going to get on to the risks in using it in a potentially new market environment with the end of the, if it is the end of the bull run, in a second. But so just on the regulatory side, what are the growing regulatory risks? I mentioned in my introduction this 18-month period that looks like it is coming in. What are the regulatory risks, or are they growing? And is it? Would you? I mean, we've got all these lawyers here today. Only Philip and I, and on this screen, are not lawyers, so we've got plenty of lawyers to give us their expert advice. Is this a dangerous thing going forward to rely upon? Lawyers, please answer.
I suppose there's a risk that you go from pre-marketing to marketing inadvertently without the requisite notifications to the relevant member state regulators. I think that's what that 18-month period potentially does. So, you know, it does restrict the ability of managers to argue that investment did arise by virtue of reverse solicitation.
Yeah.
And just to summarize that, so under the CB, the Cross-Border Distribution Directive, if you've been pre-marketing and somebody come, and then you cease pre-marketing, somebody coming on will be deemed to be a marketed person. So, but it doesn't apply directly to non-EU AIFMs, except that in some jurisdictions they are applying the rules in that way. So this is where the waters are getting muddied. And where one of the increasing risks is in this context.
Yeah. I'm going to take, sorry, you want to, sorry, please finish that thought.
Oh, I was going to say, yeah, and we've had similar situations where in order to make that step from pre-marketing to marketing, particularly where we're talking about semi-professional investors, we've had anecdotal experiences in jurisdictions like Germany where we're being forced to confront what the regulators acknowledge are matters of first impression as to whether things like remuneration limits and compensation policies will be applied to non-EU AIFMs where they haven't previously been.
Okay. I was going to quickly, I'm not necessarily do this too much because we've got a lot to go through and we're already 23 minutes past the hour, but it was a very good question that has already come in. So I'm going to quickly throw this to you. Someone could maybe take a very quick, short stab at answering this, and then I'm going to go on to the next one, which is, hasn't reverse solicitation always been just a fig leaf to cover avoidance stroke evasion of legal requirements for offering investments? Very good question from somebody called Tim Cornick. Does anyone want to take that?
I'll take a stab at that. Based on what I think we're seeing here is the tightening, call it the tightening straitjacket of the new directive and regulations that have been implemented. We've had clients who continue to be very comfortable with reverse solicitation for now narrower groups of very long-standing historic investor relationships where you can demonstrate, if it's a fund 4, fund 5, and we have relationships that were in place perhaps even prior to the implementation of AIFMD, and you have all the historical representations that they have invested in prior funds of their own initiative and they want to invest in future funds going forward, et cetera, et cetera. Yes, perhaps the circumstances in which we'll get comfortable with that are narrowing as a result. But I would not agree that it has always been a fig leaf, or that it will continue.
Okay, well, let's get on to the next subject. And Philip, can I come to you? This has been already touched upon very slightly, is we may well be in a new market environment, and somebody's already made the point that this came in when AIFMD came in. There's been these huge industry growths in Dublin and Luxembourg in particular since the directive came in, or 2013, whenever. But we've had this fantastic bull run that's basically provided a lot of people with employment, overseeing everything under the sun, not only in Dublin, Luxembourg, elsewhere too. But there hasn't been any real stress. This has been a rising tide, which has lifted pretty much all boats. That may not be where we are today. We may be in a very different market environment for the next few years. And as being touched upon, and correct me if I'm wrong here, an investor, if the lawyer for the manager hasn't given a completely legal type agreement, the investor can turn around and say, I was missold this fund by that particular manager. And if the funds were down, whatever, 30, 40, 50%, I'm going to come after you with legal action. Is that, besides all the regulatory issues we've already been discussing, is there an increasing risk of that happening, Philip?
Well, not to take a view on the direction of the market, but I think it's instructive, to the point that was just made, I think it's instructive to go back to the global financial crisis, the sort of the germination then of AIFMD that followed, but look at the litigation, the investor litigation that happened during that period, but in particular, the breadth of investor litigation. Now, that was in response to the crisis, the effort to claw back losses by investors, the incentives that they had to do it, and the lengths that they went to claw back those losses. I think the point was raised by Simon earlier that there hasn't been enforcement in this area, but it's perhaps among the most vulnerable areas that expose managers to liability. And in this case, ESMA highlighting that liability could include criminal liability. If you're looking at the sort of moving definitions and whether or not what used to be within sort of reverse solicitation and the way people perceived it, and now it's getting narrower, what you end up doing is having a position that you need to continually find ways to make sure that you're not running afoul of it, because you're likely to be exposed to some potential litigation. So, I mean, I would come back to the argument saying, well, why are you running that risk? You know, is that a risk that as an investment manager you want to run? Or would you focus something more on predictability and stability? So, yes, I do think this is an area that when there is a correction, investors are going to look for every area they can to find ways to claw back losses. And this is an area that managers are uniquely or particularly exposed to.
Right. That's interesting. Anybody else want to comment on the changing market environment and the increased potential risk that brings of using reverse solicitation? We've got an awful lot more to go on too, but if anyone wants to chip in on that. No, okay. I'm going to then move on to the next one, which is, this came out of the prep call. We had a very good prep call, I think it was on Friday. And Conrad, I'm going to come to you. You brought up, this is a term I already said, I think I've just invented, distribution intermediaries. Might they be the kind of the white knights for reverse solicitation? They can come along and save the day. You mentioned in the prep call placement agents. You also mentioned something very interesting about third-party mancos and the connection. You've been, I think, involved in one of those, and using their AFIM in Dublin or Luxembourg or wherever it may be to get around the distribution rules that we've been talking about. So I'd love to talk to you about that. But by weird coincidence, someone has just sent in a question which I'm going to read out. This is hot news off the press, at least to me. Willis Towers Watson just sold its asset management exchange to Khan. Do such interactive manager investor facilities run the gauntlet of changing RS regulations? It's vaguely connected to that distribution intermediary question. Over to you, Conrad.
Absolutely. Although just to peg to the preceding point for a minute, I think perhaps there are some low-hanging fruit that could be targeted, I guess, in terms of a correction, bear market. But I think investors will also want to take into consideration that they're players in a larger market, and if they're going to claim foul in one fund, they may find that they're met with some more resistance in other investment activities. So, but there are certain situations where that could play out favorably for the investor.
Yeah.
So on the distribution question, we've seen, I think, in the last couple of months, an interesting trend towards, and this is almost a mirror of something that we've had in the US for a while. We have a concept here of broker-dealer regulation for the placement agents and the traditional intermediaries of private placements. And there is a concept here which we refer to as chaperoning, which permits foreign broker-dealers to come into the US under the auspices of a locally registered broker-dealer to conduct this solicitation or private placement activity within the US. And what we've started to see recently under various combinations and permutations, and perhaps this will be a trend going forward, is that the reliance on a local AIFM in order to conduct pre-marketing activities is adding some additional complexity. On the other hand, it seems to be a relatively new service that's being established. And it remains a question of, which loopholes do you have to jump through, and will it actually become a viable gatekeeper role in effect? Because that's what the national regulators are doing by delegating this supervisory responsibility to the AIFMs and the third-party mancos, is saying, will you guys keep tabs on your sub-advisors and your third country managers in order to conduct pre-marketing within the rules? And I think that raises additional questions of liability and process as well that aren't easily solved.
Yeah, but if you wouldn't mind touching upon what you mentioned on Friday regarding US managers using potentially an AIFM to...
yeah, indeed. So there's one or two instances we've come across and had the privilege of advising on are where we've sort of seen a virtuous loop being created where you can have a European AIFM, be it a third-party manco or an established manager, registering under the SEC's foreign advisor or exempt reporting advisor provisions, and in effect reversing what was previously, if you had a US manager acting as a sub-advisor or a sub-portfolio manager for European mancos, they're in essence able to invert that role and say that they are now, the manco is now a reporting advisor in the US and is therefore able to avail itself of registered advisors' support in the United States. So it's yet to see. This seems to be an area of interest and developing expertise, but it does show potential synergies in what I still feel are very burdensome regulatory environments.
Yeah, this is a whole new world, a whole new development, I think, emerging here, which is it's the first time, when you mentioned that the other day, it's the first time I'd come across it.
Well, it requires a level of sophistication that I think a lot of lower and middle market managers don't possess here. And when you're forced to resort to intricate structures and governance and regulatory compliance arrangements of that nature, it really calls into question this the goal of establishing perhaps a diverse and competitive marketplace for investments and investment opportunities to European investors.
Another way of looking at it, it's the private sector, as always, staying one step ahead of the regulators, isn't it, really? With you clever lawyers helping that all happen. Is that a fair summary to the thicko non-lawyers following this today?
I feel like that's a leading question.
Emily, can I come to you and ask you, leaving aside reverse solicitation for a moment, what are the other distribution options open to managers outside the EU for distribution into the EU?
So I think my view is that if reverse solicitation is becoming more difficult, and I think we all seem to agree that it will do, if not impossible, and member states do apply the cross-border distribution rules to non-EU managers, then fund managers do have some thinking to do if they're raising a new fund and they still want to access EU capital. So using the services of a host EU manco, I think, is unlikely to reduce that risk with the rules. So what do you do? The least painful next option, depending on where the investors are based in the EU, is likely to be marketing under Article 42, so using member state national private placement regimes. Definitely my experience here in Jersey, I'm not aware of many managers which rely wholly on reverse solicitation as a strategy. I mean, we said before, it's unlikely to pass nowadays as a strategy, and maybe managers used it when the AIFMD originally came into effect, but actually for follow-on funds, it's been used less and less. And, you know, we've always advised that this is a risky policy, which, as we've heard, is as yet untested. No enforcement cases brought as far as I'm aware. But, you know, there are a number of other reasons why pre-marketing is likely to be problematic. We've mentioned the disclaimers in fund documents, representations and indemnities from investors. You know, we don't know whether those will prove sufficient to counteract an argument that a manager did in fact market a fund to them. And nor is it clear what sort of paper trail managers are likely to have to prove to you know, conclude one way or another whether there was reverse solicitation. Just to note, the rules on pre-marketing require them to be adequately documented, but there's no real explanation as to what that is. So, you know, we don't know what might be sufficient in that regard. And then there's a disgruntled investor point that has also been made. I think the inconsistencies in the member state marketing regimes and the application of the rules to non-EU managers make the landscape for EU distribution quite complex and difficult to navigate. And it's also uncertain as to what additional reporting might be required from managers who do wish to continue relying on reverse solicitation and marketing generally. So it seems clear that the burden is likely to increase, given that the view is that reverse solicitation is being used to circumvent the rules. So, you know, is there any residual advantage to relying on reverse solicitation versus national private placement regimes? Just to talk about national private placement regimes for a minute. I mean, I think the starting point is managers need certainty when establishing a new fund structure. And while these goalposts seem to be moving, the advantages of NPPRs are very well known. Reduced reporting, so for example, the no disclosure of key employee remuneration, that's always been a big one. No requirement to appoint a depository. Regulated capital requirements are disapplied. It's effectively more cost efficient, not necessary to appoint an EU Manco away from, and the regulatory obligations are frankly simplified. On top of that, they've been around for a long time now. NPPRs are tried and tested. It's a predictable route to market. And certainly in Jersey, AIFMs have been able to raise funds very successfully in this way. The licensing process for Jersey AIFMs is very straightforward. And Jersey's adopted the same regime for small managers, so sub-threshold managers as that which is set out in the AFMD. So we think this route offers the best of all worlds, the ability to access EU capital while avoiding the more onerous requirements of the AFMD, but without having to rely on reverse solicitation. So, you know, we've seen hundreds of Jersey AIFMs marketing funds successfully under NPPRs. The regime is still very much alive. It's well established, it's working, and, you know, Jersey's playing a key role in enabling managers to continue doing that. So as far as we're concerned, it works, and we don't think there's a need to rely on reverse solicitation.
Thank you. Philip, would you like to add to that?
That was a masterclass in NPPR, actually. So what I would add to that is that, you know, it's obvious that all of these rules that have been in play, and in fact, this is true beyond reverse solicitation, there's sort of legislative, legal, regulatory frameworks that were originally used as basis for capital raising and for investments have changed. This now, obviously, we're talking specifically about reverse solicitation. What I would add to that from the manager's perspective is when you're going through this process and you're thinking about how you're going to go to market, your route to market, what is it that you really value, and is something that's very predictable, tried and tested the way Emily just described it, is that valuable to you, particularly when from a efficiency standpoint, it's wildly more efficient for you as the investment manager than going under the full scope of AIFMD. So to her point, and I'd echo the same thing, I think it's actually the best of both worlds. You get the stability, you get the predictability, you get the access to market, but you have a demonstrably lower regulatory burden on top of you.
Okay. Somebody has asked a question, and we had it anyway on our list about whether you know of anyone that has been fined by a regulator for using reverse solicitation. Are there any examples of that? Given and as has been said here, several times it's been used very extensively, reverse solicitation. Someone's asked that question from the audience, but also, as I said, we had it on the list. Do you know of any? Are there any cases? I think I haven't really heard of anyone who's really been caught up and hung out to dry by a regulator because of reverse solicitation. Do any of you know anybody in that particular category?
No, but Simon, I would point to the fact that one, ESMA's gone out and has made public statements that has put reverse solicitation in the crosshairs, but they're also now going out and gathering information about this. They're not, that what has been sort of viewed previously as was going to be a very minor transitionary practice survived much longer than ESMA anticipated. And the moves that ESMA is taking now are clear that they want to focus in on this particular area. So I don't think there has been any, I'm not aware of any enforcement, but clearly ESMA is taking this much more seriously than they've ever taken it in the past.
Okay. Okay.
I mean,
sorry, go on.
Just add a couple of thoughts in from what people have been saying. I mean, obviously, if you're running a Cayman fund or a Delaware fund, and you're bringing it into, you just happen to have someone who's come in through reverse solicitation. That's fine. That's one thing. But if you were going through the national private placement rules, those rules will bite on your fund. And so, I think in some context, if the idea is you would then separately use in this case a Jersey fund, so that your national private placement rule requirements can go around that as your kind of European vehicle, if you're using the NPPRs via Jersey, because you may not want to be reporting about your whole Cayman fund when you've got dozens and hundreds of investors outside the EU or outside of Europe.
I'm glad you raised the subject of Cayman funds. I wanted to ask this question since you raised Cayman. This is the perfect time to do it. We mentioned this on our prep call. The EU has just put Cayman on its list of high-risk countries for money laundering. Do managers need to take that into account when considering their European distribution options? Emily, should we start with you? Because OGA's got a big office in Caymans.
Yeah, so as you say, the EU has put Cayman on its AML blacklist. Now, looking ahead to AIFMD2, when this comes into force, non-EU AIFs are located in third countries, which are on the EU's list of high-risk countries, or which are non-cooperative tax jurisdictions, won't be able to market into the EU under the Article 42 NPPRs, nor will Cayman AIFMs be able to conduct marketing activities in the EU under that regime. Now, if reverse solicitation also ceases to be a viable option, then really marketing options for Cayman funds and managers do become more limited. So, I would say, as we've discussed, reverse solicitation as a marketing strategy is likely to become increasingly difficult. So, I'd say, yes, market managers should be taking this sort of information into account. I mean, AIFMD2 is likely to come into force in 2024, so a lot can change by then. But I think if a manager was thinking, well, if we're still on the blacklist, we can rely on reverse solicitation, given what we've heard today, that may not be possible. So I think a little bit more thought as to how the distribution in the EU is going to work for those managers who might otherwise have considered using Cayman vehicles. Probably a good time to do that.
Yeah, because you say 2024, which sounds like an awful long time away, but it's actually only 2 years away. And if you're launching a fund, you probably expect that to be around for a lot longer than 2024. So is the implication of what you're saying that you're taking potentially an unnecessary risk if you're going down the Cayman route, if for European investors, not for others.
I think that is true, because there may come a point where you can't actually continue to raise money under the NPPR route, if that's the way you were marketing in the EU.
Anybody else want to have a quick comment on that? Because we're rapidly running out of time. I'm afraid we've got lots of questions to go to before we get to the questions. Anyone want to comment on?
Yeah, I think Cayman are pretty close to, perfecting the deficiencies in their system. So given the proliferation of Cayman hedge funds, I think even in spite of EU's political desire to snuff out certain offshore centres, I would be surprised if in 2024 Cayman is a permanent bad boy.
Yeah, I would second that, and I think we're really dealing with sort of tectonic political and regulatory forces here. And I second Emily's and Philip's point that, for a manager with illiquid funds, thinking in decades as opposed to years, we've advised on a handful of redomiciliations away from Cayman at this point. And it doesn't seem to be, it's not a significant trend, but there are players who are taking a view that we would prefer to not have to deal with this back and forth every year or two and have a more stable base of operations.
Okay, thank you. Let's go to question time then in the few minutes that we have remaining. We have a number that have come in. Someone's asked, I guess this is probably going to be a good one for you to take, Conrad. What sort of action can the EU take against a US manager, and how would they enforce it?
Well, not being the EEA lawyer, I will nevertheless have a good crack. I think the situation in which an investor would cry foul is likely the only, I think, and ESMA, or more particularly through a national regulator, will probably only take proactive action if prompted to do so by an investor complaint. They don't have necessarily the fact gathering or practical expertise that we've witnessed, at least, in the sort of SEC's ability to go out and conduct a lot of examinations and to hold people in front of tribunals on a regular basis. And so I think it would necessitate some combination of the bear market that you and Philip were discussing with the low-hanging fruit that Simon and Emily were discussing in terms of perhaps the most egregious examples of engineered reverse solicitation, poorly documented paper trails, placement agents acting irresponsibly, in combination with some form of investor loss and complaint to a regulator to trigger that kind of action. And then I think you would only find the investor doing that if the manager were already a dead duck, essentially. That leaves the question of recovery. What would it achieve?
Anybody else want to comment on that?
Yeah, I mean, by way of analogy, there was a time, probably still is, when the FCA here would have a sort of blacklist of bad boys who were cold calling people from the States. You may have been victim of that yourself, but people going through telephone lists and trying to get you to invest in boiler room stocks and things. There is a limit to what European regulators can do. But I would have thought ESMA are actually, it sounds like they're on a fact-finding mission now. And one of the questions about the tower, Watson or whatever, is probably, I don't know the actual situation of what the facts are, but it's probably like some introductory service that, one person's looking the other way, the other one the other, and they somehow managed to tie them up. And there were, some of the European stock exchanges were marketing effectively a reverse solicitation strategy by saying, list your fund here, because then people can just contact you because you had a regulatory requirement to post information about your fund on the exchange. And that can work for reverse solicitation. Maybe it can't if people start to look at that and issue guidance on it.
Okay. Emily, there's a question here which has absolutely got your name all over. Let me read it out. Once ESMA feels it has closed off reverse solicitation, won't they go after NPPR on the basis that uniformity is the be-all and end-all of the EU? And isn't there something in AIFMD that says NPPRs should be superseded by AIFMD anyway?
Well, I mean, we know the NPPRs are implemented, at member state level in various ways. There isn't any uniformity, but I think the basic provisions under Article 42 are clearly set. It's how member states implement other things, like, for example, the appointment of a depository, or the reverse solicitation rules and the pre-marketing rules, that sort of thing. It's possible that ESMA will try and create a more level playing field there. It's not something I've sort of heard coming down the line at the moment, but I wouldn't be surprised if it is something that does come down the line.
Okay. Anybody else want to comment on that?
Yeah, I mean,
particular question.
I think it's probably getting at where we come to the point where to sell funds in the EU, you are a regulated EU AIFM, whether based in the EU or as and when it's applied in approved jurisdictions, which we were getting close to prior to Brexit, but which seems to be dangling in the air at the moment.
Yeah.
If I could, one point, and to the lawyers actually on the panel, but if there is a if there were to be a decision to put an end to NPPR, the transition period is 3 years. Is that correct, Emily? Is it a 3-year transition to AIFMD? And furthermore, I think Jersey is at the top of the list for third country passports if AIFMD were to become the singular rule.
I'm not sure about the 3 years. Simon might know that, but certainly yes. Pre-Brexit, it was looking much more positive than it is now. I think since Brexit, it seems that third country passports have been put on the back burner.
Yeah, I haven't checked the timeline exactly recently, but it's certainly when AIFMD came in, it was then intended to be in 2018 that the whole thing would start to be turned upside down. But the end date keeps getting moved, and there certainly doesn't seem to be any mad rush to bring in those provisions.
Okay, you've both just mentioned Brexit and how that's affected things. By coincidence, there is a question that I haven't put to you yet. We've just got time to do it now, I think. Is how much has all that we've been talking, I'm going to slightly expand upon the question, how much that all we've been talking about here for the last hour has actually been caused by Brexit and the desire of the Commission, at least if not so much ESMA, to slap down what are now third country managers from the UK doing naughty things in the European Union, and US managers represented by Conrad and many US lawyers maybe getting caught in the crossfire here. And I'll add to that, since Simon touched upon AIFMD2, which of course has been delayed because of Brexit as well. What are the dangers inherent in that, or what's coming down the line as a result of Brexit, and the fact AIFMD, for those who may not know this, was actually created originally by the Commission as a way of sort of stamping down on us naughty British people in the City of London and the West End, and was actually potentially one of the reasons for the motivations for Brexit to happen. But that's a conversation more for another day. Back to the question, how much this is all caused by Brexit, how much US managers have been caught in the crossfire, Brexit hadn't happened, we'll be even having this conversation today.
Well, the comment I made at the beginning about MiFID and ESMA's view on reverse solicitation there was certainly motivated by Brexit. But that's to do with selling investment services into Europe that weren't funds particularly, or they might have been investment management services or other services. I think UK managers have got themselves structured well ahead of the game for Brexit. So if they needed to use the passport, they were getting themselves based in addition in Luxembourg and Ireland. And in any case, most of them are regulated back here anyway. So actually marketing under national private placement rules isn't particularly painful because a lot of that you're subject to already. So I think for US managers, so it isn't really an issue in terms of non-European managers coming in and marketing in the European Union. I don't think Brexit is necessarily the catalyst for these discussions that are going on at ESMA and the Commission about reverse solicitation.
You don't. I'm interested. You don't. You don't, Simon, because a lot of people think that Brexit is the motivator behind it. But anyway, that's fair enough. Anyone else want to comment on that? We're rapidly running out of time, but please chip in very quickly if there's anything else you want to say before we wind this up. No? There is a very long question which I hesitate to get into because if I asked it, it would probably take us over the time limits come in on the chat. So I think we may have to leave that. Thank you for that long question. But I think in light of the time, I'm probably going to wind this up by saying, thanking first of all Jersey Finance for sponsoring this event. Thank you all of you around the world who have been following us. I mentioned at the beginning we launched a publication for US, not only, but particularly for US managers and their advisors looking to come to Europe or go offshore. We will be covering this subject, both this conversation and distribution in general in that. And if you are looking for some help with selection of domiciles, mancos, service providers or directors, then do take advantage of our service there. And hopefully see you all very soon. Thank you very much, Simon, Emily, Philip, and Conrad for your contributions. And have a good afternoon or evening, wherever you may be. Hopefully see you the next time. Bye-bye, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. Thank you.